Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will get started in just a few moments. While we're waiting, please say hello to the 100 team in the chat, enjoy some relaxing music, and get ready for an engaging discussion on formative assessment. I'm joining you today from sunny Helsinki. It is a scorcher here today. That's why we have this lounge music. And our head of community is speaking in the chat, so please do tell her where you're from and say hello. With that, I think we can get started. So if we could go ahead and pause the music, we will. Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest 100 webinar, Formative Assessment, Improving Learning for Every Child. Today, we'll be discussing the critical role that students play in their own learning, how to use formative assessment to improve student achievement, and highlighting 14 education innovations at the forefront of formative assessment globally. We have some pretty incredible speakers lined up for you today, including Dr. Dylan Wiliam, one of the leading experts on the topic of formative assessment, who you will hear from in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, I am Mariah O'Mara, the head of communications at 100, and I will be your host for today. A few housekeeping points before we get started. So you can ask questions in the chat at any time and in the Q&A box below. We will have a dedicated time for audience questions, but it will be quite short. So if we aren't able to answer your questions during the webinar, we are also hosting a live networking session right after this event, which you are all very cordially invited to, where you'll be able to meet and chat with other presenters and participants. So please do stick around for that, especially if you have any burning questions. All of the resources will be shared during this webinar and will be sent to you within the next few days. And finally, we will be uploading the recording of today's webinar on the 100 YouTube channel in case you'd like to share it or revisit it again later. So to give you a sense of what to expect in today's session, you can now see a breakdown of the agenda on your screen. To start off, we will have a discussion with the Spotlight partners from both 100 and the Jacobs Foundation. And then we will hear from Dr. Dylan Wiliam on the topic. We will then introduce some of our selected innovators who will be divided into two panels, one on student agency and the other on scaling. This discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Clara Garcia-Millán. And after that, we will hear a reflection from Dr. Wiliam, who will act as a discussant. We'll then move into a short Q&A before we move to another platform for some virtual networking. So before I pass it off to our guest speakers, I want to talk about the reason that we are here today. So for those of you new to 100, essentially what we do is we partner with organizations like the Jacobs Foundation to identify and highlight impactful and scalable education innovations, either under a specific theme, like formative assessment, or a geographic location. Our 100 research team works with the partner, the innovators, and our 100 Academy to then package these innovations into a research report. It's available to download free on the 100 website and the Jacobs Foundation website right now. We will add a link in the chat. One more thing to highlight before I pass it over is the definition of formative assessment, which is really why we're here today. So formative assessment refers to a variety of methods that teachers use in classrooms to conduct in-process evaluations for student comprehension, learning needs, and academic progress. So with that, I would like to invite to the virtual stage our first speakers, Julia Weiss, Programs Manager for the Jacobs Foundation, and Lasse Leponiemi, Executive Director and Co-founder of 100. Welcome, Lasse, who is joining us from Paris today. And welcome, Julia. It's so great to have you here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Marija, and great to see you here, Julia. My name is Lasse Lepponiemi. I'm the Executive Director at 100, and during the last years, we have been putting together quite a many spotlights, and at the time when Jacobs Foundation introduced or called us and said like, hey, there is something we would like to do in assessment sector, we were very excited about this opportunity. But Julia, is there anything you would like to add to the formative assessment description we were just hearing before?
I wouldn't add to the description, thank you, but maybe I can say a bit why we think this topic is important, because the Jacobs Foundation is focusing on variability of learning and providing each child with the possibility to reach their full potential. And we see formative assessment as one way of supporting child learning in school. And at the foundation, we do support child learning by generating evidence and implementing that into practice. And so to have empirical evidence on how individualized learning and adaptive teaching can work in practice is of very high interest to the foundation. And then, of course, visibility of information on best practices, such as through a 100 Spotlight report, is of course important to make the message known.
Yes, and I was participating last week in Schools 2030 Forum in Tanzania, where we discussed a lot like how the learning is taking place in a developing context. And now this week I'm here in Paris to attend the UNESCO Transforming Education Systems discussions. And in both of these events, I think we have been discussing so much about the importance of the learning and how we are able to assess the students' needs and the abilities to also understand how they are learning by themselves. So not only measuring the actual kind of like learning as it has taken place, but also like supporting the students understand what kind of learners they actually are. And I think like we were so excited about this opportunity to work with you on this very important theme. And like I was writing to the report forward, I was mentioning that we have had thousands of education innovations in our platform, but actually one of the areas where we always have had a little less is assessment. And now through this work we have done together, I'm very proud to say that we have fantastic assessment and formative assessment education innovations around there, and I really want to thank from bottom of my heart that you trusted in us in this process, and then together we have been able to highlight these fantastic innovators. But what are your thoughts on the selected innovators for this spotlight, Julia?
Well, I'm truly impressed as you are by the innovators that we have been able to select, and I would really like to congratulate them all to have made it to the report. And it's fascinating to see that we have such a broad range of countries and types of innovation. So we really see that formative assessment can be tackled at various levels of the educational system. And so on the classroom practices, for example, or whole school development, educational technology, and much more, of course, also including teacher professional development. So to see that is really fantastic. And if I have 1 minute left, I would like to thank all of the innovators for bringing up their ideas and for reflecting on their experience and share their knowledge with a broader audience, because that's really important, and we're grateful for having had this opportunity, and of course for the support of our advisory team. I think they have not been mentioned yet, for their support in reviewing. And finally, I would also like to thank the 100 team for a very fruitful collaboration that we had over the past, and for your continued effort in disseminating information on educational innovation and bringing together like-minded people like today in this webinar. So real pleasure to working with you.
Thank you both
Julia.
so much. Thank you, Lasse. Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you for telling us a little bit more about the partnership and the reasons behind it. And of course, highlighting the innovators, which I hope our audience is more excited than ever to hear from a little bit later in the program. So with that, I would like to invite our keynote speaker, Dylan Wiliam, to the stage. We are so honored to have you with us today, Dr. the Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at UCL Institute of Education. And I have to say, our research team was very excited, and we are very, very honored to have you with us today. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Marat. So if you could stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine.
Perfect.
Thank you. So I think the first thing to say is that in my work over the last 25 years on formative assessment, I have become convinced that there's no such thing as a formative assessment. Because as soon as you start thinking about formative assessment as a thing, then you go down the wrong path. For me, formative is a description of the conclusions we draw. Any assessment can be used formatively or summatively. So I might discover that a child knows 50% of their number facts from 1 times 1 up to 10 times 10. That's a summative conclusion. That's a conclusion about status. But if I look at the test results more carefully, I might see that that child is having some difficulty with their 7 times table. That's a formative conclusion. So I think the first thing to say is, I think it'll be much easier to make sense of these ideas if we think of formative and summative, not as kinds of assessment, but as descriptions of the uses that we make of the information that those assessments generate. Now, there's a very strong empirical case for formative assessment. Most of these studies are reviews of research. I'd like to draw your attention to the last one here, Spekessa et al. This is a result of a randomized controlled trial involving 140 high schools in England. Half were given money, half were given resources to help the teachers develop formative assessment with no external support. The outcome measure was the students' achievement on a school leaving examination involving at least 8 subjects. And what they found is that even though teachers spend 1% of their time discussing formative assessment with their colleagues, it produced a 25% increase in the progress that students made over their last 2 years of compulsory high school. We don't know of anything that has even close to that in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Oh, by the way, the cost was about $2 per student per year. A 25% increase in the rate of student progress by changing how teachers spend 1% of their time. That's why formative assessment is essential for all teachers, all schools, all districts to embrace. There's also an intuitive case you could make, and it comes from a principle about learning and an uncomfortable fact about the world. The principle about learning comes from the work of David Ausubel, who over 50 years ago now said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. This is the point that Julia made. We should actually start from where the students are rather than where we'd like them to be. Why is that so hard? Because of the uncomfortable fact about the world, our students do not learn what we teach. They do sometimes, but a lot of the time, the sense they make of our lessons is not the sense we had intended. And if good teaching starts from where the students are, rather than where we'd like them to be, then we have to make sure we find that out. That's why formative assessment is at the heart of effective teaching. Assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It is only by assessing that we can figure out whether what we just did as teachers results in the learning we had intended. Another way to think about this is to build in some contingency into our teaching. The idea is that we actually teach, but then we find out what our students have learned. Teachers have always done this. They do what are called frequent checks for understanding. But in many countries, I would say probably most countries that I visited, when teachers do this, they do it in a rather simplistic way. So I see teachers deciding they need to find out whether the class can move on or not. They ask the class a question, 6 students raise their hands, the teacher chooses one of them, and if that student gives a correct answer, that teacher says, good, and moves on. In other words, that teacher is making a decision about the learning needs of a diverse group of learners based on the responses of 1 or 2 confident volunteers. So what I'm suggesting is we need to actually improve that decision-making by improving the quality of the evidence that teachers have. Improving it in 2 ways. The first is deeper. So asking questions that are worth asking, for example, in elementary school, which is bigger, 0.25 or 0.3? Why is that a powerful question? Because many children think that 25 is bigger than 3, and therefore 0.25 is bigger than 0.3. In secondary school science, not would your weight be the same on the moon, but would your mass be the same on the moon? Surprisingly, many students think that your mass would be less on the moon because your weight would be less on the moon. So better evidence in terms of deeper, and then better evidence in terms of broader, getting information from every single student in the group rather than just the confident students. And this is my greatest critique of what I see all over the world in terms of teaching. Teachers making decisions about the learning needs of a diverse group of learners based on the responses of 1 or 2 confident individuals. You cannot possibly be dealing with the learning needs of diverse learners if you're only hearing from the confident, articulate students. The equation of formative assessment is simply better evidence equals better decisions equals better learning. Now, there's been a big debate about what formative assessment is and isn't. And in this webinar, we're going to hear lots of different takes on formative assessment. And we have what some people would call a kind of turf war. People saying, well, that's formative assessment, that's not formative assessment. And I don't think those descriptions or those discussions are very helpful, people marking out their own territory. So I think we should define formative assessment inclusively by thinking about long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle formative assessment based on the span, the length of the cycle, and what gets formed by the formative assessment. So for example, in many countries, formative assessment is largely a process of across a term or a semester or a teaching unit, typical cycle length of 4 weeks to 1 year. An assessment is conducted to see, are the students making progress? This is a good thing to do. You can monitor student progress. You can also align your curriculum to your students' needs. There's also an important aspect of formative assessment that focuses around sharing learning intentions with the learners, what Richard Stiggins calls student-involved assessment. Within and between teaching units, typically 1 to 4 weeks. The outcome of this is that assessment becomes something that's done with students rather than to them. But the research, I think, now shows pretty clearly that while those 2 processes that I've mentioned, the long cycle and the medium cycle formative assessment, are important, the biggest impact comes when you do it within and between lessons, minute by minute and day by day. So rather than thinking about formative assessment as happening every 20 days, we should be thinking about it as happening every 20 minutes. Teachers have always done this, of course. They've always asked questions, relied on the expressions on students' faces, but they haven't done it very effectively because the quality of their evidence was actually quite poor. So here's an example of 5 and 6-year-olds learning how to write a grammatically correct sentence in English, and the teacher stressing the usual 3 things. Start with a capital letter, finger-sized spaces between the words, end with a stop sign. And she's projected a sentence onto the interactive whiteboard, and she simply asked the students, is this correct? There's one boy at the front left there, more interested in me than everything else. I could not get him to turn around. Most of the students think there's a mistake. There's one boy at the front right there thinking it's correct. He's holding up a green disc. The teacher then says, you think there's a mistake. Tell me what it is. We'll fix it. We'll vote again. The point is the teacher is getting a constant stream of high quality evidence about what's going on in the students' heads to make better decisions that better meet those students' learning needs. And that's why the most powerful formative assessment involves a shift from traditional linear teaching towards a pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. The idea is that teachers getting evidence from all the students rather than just the usual suspects. And the teacher is using that information constantly to adjust her teaching in real time to better meet student learning needs. Now, to actually flesh this out, I think it's important to understand that while in many jurisdictions, formative assessment has been conceptualized primarily in terms of the teacher's role, the work that I and my colleagues have done over the last 25 years have always started with the student. So we have the role of the teacher, the peer, and the student, where they're going, where they are right now, and how to get there. That gives us 5 key processes of learning, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But here's the important point for me. All these strategies ultimately work towards the last one. The whole idea of formative assessment is to put learners more effectively in charge of their own learning, because then the students are able to take their own learning forward. So for example, a good way to think about feedback is good feedback works towards its own redundancy. The idea is that good feedback empowers the learners with the skills they need to manage their own learning more effectively. And if we think about the role of formative assessment as primarily to help students become more effective at managing their own learning, I think most of the pieces fall into place. One last perspective, which I think may help provide an organizing focus for this webinar, is to think about the second and third strategies as responsive teaching. The big idea here is that teachers get evidence about learning and respond to it appropriately. The second and the third rows constitute the learner's role. But here's a really important point. Formative assessment does not tell you what to teach. It does not tell you what your students should be learning. It does not tell you what happens when learning takes place. It makes no assumptions about what it means to understand. It is just a recognition of the fact that what students learn is unpredictable. So before you can even begin, the teacher needs to be clear about the learning intentions, and then formative assessment can help. But the idea is that formative assessment is an all-purpose, scalable approach to teaching. It is simply based around the idea that students don't always make the sense we want of our teaching, and we'll teach better if we have evidence about that and adjust our teaching to better meet the students' learning needs.
Thank you so much for really helping ground us in the topic, Dr. Wiliam. And I can see a lot of questions in the chat. Please do hang on to your questions. We will hear more from Dr. Wiliam soon. But for now, we're going to, I would like to introduce my colleague, Clara Garcia-Millán, who has the honor of introducing our stars of the honor, the selected innovators for our formative assessment spotlight. So over to you, Clara.
Thank you, Mariah, and thank you, Dr. Wiliam, for that very insightful presentation. I'm Clara Garcia-Millán, and I'm the education specialist and researcher at 100. Over the past few months, I've been in close contact with these innovations that you can see now in the screen. And I've had the privilege to interview some of them for the report that is now available on our website. So I'm very thrilled to introduce them to you today. We are going to discuss about 2 main topics in this panel, and I'm very excited that Dr. Wiliam already presented some insights related to student agency and scalability for formative assessment. And the way we have structured this panel discussion is that we have divided the 10 innovators into 2 different groups. So in this first group, we have Nancy Garzon, Director of Formative Insights at West Ed. We have Juhani Katayamaki, International Sales and Learning at CRIDI. We have Wendy Wee Choi, Learning in Assessment Manager at the International Baccalaureate. We have Abdul Chauhan, VP of Learning at Socrative, and Prasad Ram, founder and CEO at Guru. So if you want, you can already turn on your cameras, the 5 participants of this panel. Welcome everyone, and thank you for your participation today. Something that I find fascinating of this panel is that they all come from different countries, different backgrounds, but they have one thing in common, and it's that they are all experts in implementing formative assessment in different forms and practices. So it's very exciting to hear from them. We'll start with the first topic, student agency, and I will direct some questions to you directly, but please feel free to jump in and interact with each other. Let's start with a quick definition. The concept of student agency is defined by the OECD as the capacity to set a goal, reflect, and act responsibly to affect change. It is about acting rather than being acted upon, shaping rather than being shaped, and making responsible decisions and choices rather than accepting those determined by others. When students are agents in their learning, that is when they play an active role in deciding what and how they will learn. So this is how we understand student agency, and I will start with a question for Nancy. When we were interviewing her for this project, she told us something that I found really powerful. She said something like, people learn by building on what they already know. We believe that formative assessment mirrors this construct, and it is one of the reasons why it can be so powerful in schools. And Dr. Wiliam was already talking a little bit about this. So Nancy, from this perspective, what does student agency look like when formative assessment is implemented well? Or in other words, how does formative assessment support student agency?
First of all, thank you for having the opportunity to share this panel with other innovators. And the framing of student agency as a key construct in formative assessment is so important and yet often missed. So we often see formative assessment presented as only for teachers, and teachers make some changes in their practice, and those are really important and good changes, but it doesn't get to the point where we're really pressing right now in our work in the United States, where teachers become transparent about what they've learned, about how they use evidence to guide learning, and then teach that directly to students. So the process, as Dr. Williams mentioned, of peer feedback as an example, it isn't just like bad peer feedback is bad for students. So what are the strategies that teachers can use to model and scaffold and give feedback on the process of giving feedback so that students learn this as a skill that they can use across any content area and in their learning? I'm reminded of something that Dr. Wiliam said in some of his earlier videos, which is students have tremendous insight into how they learn. And so student agency, when it is taught, can deeply activate that for students and give them the space to be metacognitive, give them the opportunity to interpret and use evidence to guide their own learning. And in a sociocultural context where we have students learning from one another, because students often learn better from one another than from their teachers. They tell us this all the time in our work. That framing of how you sort of bring the students back to understanding the skills of metacognition, the skills of self-regulation, to monitor their own learning, it changes everything. It changes motivation. It changes students' ability and beliefs in themselves. It changes students' identities and their ability to say, I know stuff, even if it's not yet in the academic language that a teacher might use. So it is what this work is about. As empowering it is to change the teacher role, this idea of minute by minute, day by day assessment gives students an opportunity to be part of the conversation and partners with teachers in their learning process.
Thank you, Nancy. That was very interesting when you were talking about self-regulation. And I want to direct the next question to maybe Yuhani, Abdul, or Prasad, because they all work to create edtech solutions that are helping teachers implement formative assessment at the classroom level. So what is the role of edtech in this self-regulation process? When you design your products, how is the role of the student taken into account?
So if I may start, thank you on my behalf as well. It's a pleasure to be in this panel and an honor. And also to give a shout out to the rest of the CRIDI team who are watching. So hi there. Well, the role of tech is kind of important. We believe, obviously, we have a product for that. But it's important to show those processes and the progress that the students make in them, and especially for the learners. And in order to become self-regulated, you need to learn self-assessment and how to start learning that skill and how to teach that skill. Well, the first thing that you need to do is to make these things visible. So what are the trends? Who's going up? Who's going down? And like in the picture that Dr. Wiliam showed about those students showing the colored responses, how can you do that in a way that is as well structured as possible, giving that feedback to the teachers, but not only to the teachers, but to the learners. So when they see visually what their learning path is, be it a mountain, or for the little ones, we've made it a train, or simply graphs, line graphs going up or down, that's when they can start to understand how their actions affect how things are going. And these visual aids really facilitate the discussion that happens between the stakeholders of learning, not excluding the parents or let's say the school leadership as well. So what tech can bring is kind of really easy to understand visualization and kind of input-output data collection of the learning process, which can work as a platform for everything that happens then actually in human interaction.
I can build on what Juhani just said. I'm Prasad Ram. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to share the panel with other innovators. Like Dr. Wiliam said, that formative assessment is the description of the use of the assessment. And what tech brings is the ability to capture real-time data. So I'll just switch you to another context. You know, when you shop on Amazon, do you realize that Amazon is capturing data about you every time you search for a product, every time you change the color of the product and see the product in a different color, every time you add it to the shopping cart, delete it from the shopping cart, it's capturing over 100 events a minute. And it's not about every 20 days we are going to give out one set of questions, but it's all the activities that the student is actually doing, which is, are they spending time on this recommended activity? How much time are they spending? Are they sharing it with people? Are they answering people's questions on other people's questions on a discussion forum? Everything produces data. So formative assessments is really capturing real-time data, which is number one. And two, using that to understand who the learner is. The word personalization begins with the word person. So anybody who says we personalize, but don't know who the person is, kind of is actually using it in the marketing sense. And but if you have a representation model of who the person is, and you're using the real-time data to understand who the person is, then you can kind of support the learner either with recommendations or support the learner with recommendations to the teacher or to their peers and so forth. Now, in terms of what we kind of want to enable for formative assessment, for student agency, is partly in the culture of learning in that place. Since there are a lot of cultures that at least we have interacted with in the process of our company's implementation, where aspects of self-confidence, motivation, grit, all of these are lacking. And since they may have very good knowledge of math, but they just don't, the ability to take agency of their own learning, right? Which is when provided the choice of what they learn, when they learn, how they learn, why they learn, even the culture to exercise the choice doesn't exist, right? So, so to enable student agency, yes, we have to, in my view, it's real-time data, right? We think about it as formative assessments, and as Dr. Wiliam said, it's really the use of the assessment. And to me, I turn the word assessment into data. I'm saying, hey, we are capturing 100 events per minute. Now, how do we kind of use that assessment in a formative way? But then really tackle the aspect of culture of learning so that the student feels permitted to take agency. Otherwise, all the data and all the AI and recommendations and so forth will only go so far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Prasad. Abdul, do you have anything to build on that? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, first of all, I think it's really refreshing to hear a session on assessment. I think, excuse me, I think mostly as a former principal and having worked with schools all over the world, I think my feeling is quite often in education, we do the wrong things really well. And I think this is fantastic that we are actually kind of talking about something that actually matters and how technology sits on that. For me, and certainly the team at Socrative and in the work that I've been doing in assessment and feedback as well, technology is at a point where actually it's very humanized. So what I mean by that is it allows us to connect with individual students in a very, very short space of time. It doesn't, technology works well, technology works best when it's simple and reliable. It just needs to be super simple. And I think that as long as it's simple and reliable, teachers tend to use it. It doesn't need to be very high tech. And even in low tech scenarios, certainly in schools that we're working with in India, certain places in Africa, even with kind of using 3G signals and stuff like that, we're able to see students connect, and teachers can actually see, even 50, 60 students in the classroom, you can see who's answered, the red, green, amber, all that kind of stuff. You can kind of, you know, immediately see the responses from students. And I think that is quite powerful. From a student agency perspective, what I think that's where this becomes really great is where students themselves are able to use the data and information to discover their own learning gaps. And I think that's really powerful. You know, yes, teachers can do that, and teachers are usually very great at doing that. But when students can are able to kind of see where they're going wrong, and where they are then able to kind of correct themselves or look at the next steps or connect with their peers to say, hey, you got this as green and I got this as red, so where have I gone wrong, and so on. And for them to address misconceptions themselves is actually quite powerful in that peer-to-peer connection. So I think technology is fantastic when it allows us to do things that we couldn't do in the past, or it really kind of allows us to save time. And that's something that we're seeing certainly with assessment. Where Dylan was saying earlier on, that it's one or two students nodding their heads and then the teacher moves on. Well, actually now we're in a position that every student has to respond, and you can see the students that haven't responded, and you're using that real-time data to inform next steps for learning. And I think this is potentially the kind of the way forward with assessment.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. Again, the self-regulation piece of that. We have 1 more minute for this panel. I would like to hear from Wendy, if you are here, Wendy. Yes, great. So you are working for the initiative Peer Feedback Using Comparative Judgment, and we've been already talking about the role of the peer and the peer assessment. So from your experience, how do you see peer dynamics coming into play with formative assessment?
Yeah, I think that's such a key part about formative assessment, because in the IB, we talk a lot about peer learning, collaborative learning, and we think that formative assessment itself is not just individuals looking at their own work, but definitely what we used was comparative judgment, just as a tool for students to be giving feedback to each other, to helping each other learn. And you can see that there's a very healthy collaborative dynamics there. Students generally want to help their peers learn, and they also know that the feedback that they get from their peers would be helpful to them. And so it's not just about students getting feedback from the teacher, but this is really where student agency comes into play, because they know that if they give good feedback to their peers, they will be helping everyone to learn, and everyone improves at the same time. And of course, I want to take this chance just to be thanking my team partners, Eric and Andrew, because they are the ones doing the hard work in the classroom with their students to actually make this research possible.
Thank you, Wendy, and we are sending them greetings from here. Unfortunately, we cannot continue with this panel because we are running out of time and we need to jump into the other group, but I would recommend the panelists here to check the chat, because I can see that it's very active and everybody's giving you comments and questions. So maybe you can continue there the conversation, and also, of course, at the end, we have the networking session that you all are welcome to join. So thank you, everyone, and let's move to the next panel. I'm very happy to present the next panelists that can already come to the stage. In this group, we have Jan Rihak, founder and CEO of ClassTime. We have Huong Ha T2, education manager at process-oriented child monitoring at VVOB. Alexandra Trinder-Smith, executive head at Siyabula Foundation. Jean Raphael Tomsek, Director of Product and Strategy at Sapientia, and Richard Wilson, co-founder at Maths Pathway. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. While you are joining the panel, I will give a very quick definition as well of scalability. So this is how we define scalability here at 100. So we understand that scalability means that an innovation or practice is either actively expanding to other contexts or has a high degree of transferability for others to adopt its practice or technology. So let's move to the content content, let's start with Jan from Class Time. During your interview, Jan, you emphasized the importance of listening to what teachers want and introducing their feedback into your product. And Class Time has been already implemented in several countries. So can you walk us through the process of expanding into another context? What do you first take into account when implementing your innovation in a new market?
Thanks a lot for having me, Clara, and everybody. Very happy and honored. So on scaling, to share our experiences, I think it's first of all, it's very exciting and interesting for tools like Class Time that formative assessment is becoming more and more relevant people focus more and more on it, independent of geography. The way it is delivered sometimes, it's slightly different. And what has worked well for us, particularly, is basically, following a little bit the pull of individual teachers that have the solution accessible in a free version, in a B2C version, and see where we have the highest pull. That way we, for example, deployed Class Time first in a translated version to countries like Ukraine, which we would have not expected to pick up that strongly. We now have 15% of all the teachers in Ukraine, the biggest basically share per country, right? But also then US, Europe, we see hotspots in places like Estonia, also Thailand. Sometimes sign-ups of teachers in the masses per day, right? When we see those hotspots, we believe that we can work with the teachers and be as helpful as possible, right? For example, detailing how the solution can be used specific to didactic use cases, and those didactic use cases are instructions might be different per geography, like Germany, Switzerland, focusing more on, differentiation, student agency, autonomous learning. Also digital exams are very relevant to those countries. In places like the US, we need to do more on exciting students. We need to basically prepare how the solution can be used for social emotional learning, come up with exotic use cases like digital escape rooms. So these are all topics that we try to prepare in blog posts and kind of the didactical settings that they can use. Assessment content, pre-made content is relevant. That's very relevant locally, and mapping those to competency structures and standards. And then, as you said, Clara, then basically constantly working with those users and looking at the feedback, engaging with them, and trying to be as supportive and helpful as possible to work with the pull from the teachers in those markets. That's basically the strategy that has worked well for Class Time. Might not be the only one, but that's what we believe it works quite well.
Thank you, Jan. Very important about understanding the context. And that's exactly what I want to move now. I would like to talk about scaling up the culture of assessment. And maybe I can ask this question to Huang from the Process-Oriented Child Monitoring Program, because your innovation has had an incredible impact at the national level in Vietnam. So based on your experience, how can we scale a culture of formative assessment and personalized learning? And in which ways does formative assessment align with the teacher values in the context you work?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me representing the VLB team to share our experiences in scaling our innovation, process-oriented child monitoring, or so-called FORM. For us, over the years of implementing our innovation in Vietnam, we see that scaling the culture of formative assessment, we need to start from piloting the innovation, understanding its added value to the children's learning outcome, as we have said a lot throughout the last hour, via adjusted the teaching approaches. And I think that evidence and positive first-hand experiences are very crucial to tell the story. We need to have successful stories even failures, but successful stories are very powerful in demonstrating the innovations to the teachers, to the school leaders, as well as the education partners. And so showing the benefits of formative assessment, how it helps improve the learning outcomes of children. And then we need to have a clear vision and support from the Ministry of Education. So we need to get it aligned with the policy to ensure that what we are doing in the country is also to support to realize the quality education for all. Leaving no one behind, especially in this context of a lot of changes and challenges of the world today. So in Vietnam, POM has gone through this process over the past 6-7 years, testing at the small scale, investing in research, building an evidence, and demonstrating positive changes to get the ministry on board. It has been a lengthy process, but it works well, and we have seen lots of interest from our partners in scaling up the innovations in Vietnam. In addition, we think that we need also to improve and then finding a way to integrate the innovation in the in-service teacher professional development. Our innovation is working with the preschool teachers, building the capacity for the government partners who are responsible to provide the effective school-based teacher professional development in Vietnam. So we need to start with the deep reflection on current practices, how they do, how they see what can be done to improve the way that we are working, or what we can do to improve the learning and the changes in the classroom. Do we really look into the needs and interests of the children in the classroom? So in addition, the educational change, applying what we have learned, we need the encouragement and nurturing an enabling environment for the school teachers to implement, to carry out it in the classroom context. So here, the school leaders are the key in creating this condition for the teachers. I think that in the case in Vietnam, this has been applied so well, and we have seen the success from supporting environment for the teachers to create this change in the classroom context. Lastly, maybe we need to look into integrating the innovation in the pre-service training, as more teachers have obtained teaching qualification through the higher education. So during the teacher training, more concrete and practical guidance to translate the approaches, the policy into the practice need to be introduced from the beginning, provided as a foundational framework for the ready teachers to do their job in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Huang. Very, very great points. Maybe I will direct the last two questions for Alexandra and Jean. I think those are the last two participants that we need to hear today. And they both work with EdTech platforms. We were talking about technologies before. So before we were listening about this technology in the role of student agency, but now when we are talking about scaling, it also has a very relevant role. So first of all, Alexandra, how can technology be used to help scale formative assessment? And then I will ask Jean, what are the challenges that you have faced in scaling formative assessment? Because we know that we can all go to download an app and use a digital platform, but what are the challenges? So let's start with Alexandra with the relationship between technology and scaling formative assessment, and then let's go to the challenges.
So I think, thank you very much for having us here, and it's great to be representing Siyabula at this on this platform. One of the things that Dylan mentioned in his very first presentation was that formative assessment is a way for teachers to gather more evidence, deeper evidence and broader evidence. And I think technology is a very easy way to do that because that's what technology is good at. So Prasad mentioned that every time you do anything on the internet, technology is gathering information on you. And so it's a very easy way to collect lots of evidence about lots of different people, which then can be collated. And then the part that the humans need to do is make decisions based on that data and evidence. So using technology to scale, it's a good idea to start looking at the context in which you are working, looking at what is available. So for example, in South Africa, the context was that mobile penetration is very, very high. And although data is expensive, it's very easy, or it's not easy, but it's one of the things that we work very hard on to get telecom companies on board. So if we get partnerships going across various sectors, we can use technology very effectively to scale our interventions. And I think that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it's very important to get buy-in from all the stakeholders involved, which includes learners, teachers, ministries and education departments, and parents, to support the use of this technology in order to get teachers the evidence that they need to make the various decisions required by formative assessment.
Thank you, Alexandra. Xian, would you like to continue talking also about the challenges? We see that technology is very scalable. What are the challenges that you have faced?
Sure, I can. So thank you to having us. I'm Jem. I'm representing SAPH here. So the challenges that we discover here in Brazil is that when you use technology, we have to be more formative than instructive, and show to all that to all the teachers and the students that technology can be and must be a creative tool. We have to show to the teachers and managers that we have something to say. We are educators too, and we work hard to make new ways to put the student and in the center of this process of learning. We find a lot of challenge, like how to show to teachers that they can change. They can change their practice with pedagogic planning and thinking in new ways to involve students in and engage them. I think that the most challenging question was about how to select the effective data and the right information and pack them to show to the school. Because when we start to follow every step from the students and also the teachers, we take a lot of data. Which of this data is the best one to show, and which data can help them to learn more, to learn better, and to develop themselves.
Thank you, Xian. That was very insightful. And I think we can move to the next section. I think we are running a little bit out of time. So I want to say thank you again to all our panelists. We are receiving lots of messages and questions in the chat, so please have a look. And yeah, we will have the networking session after this webinar, so please stay here and you will have the chance to talk to them personally. Thank you so much again, and over to you, Mariah.
Thank you so much, Clara. And thank you to all of our panelists and our speakers and Dr. Wiliam, who had to leave. But I encourage you, if you have not already, please do check the chat. There's been a lot of really good questions. And I want to thank the audience for being so amazing and engaged in this panel and this discussion and the topic. It's been really inspiring to see so many great questions and such attentive listeners. So we are running short on time. There have been quite a few questions answered in the chat already. And I would like to say, just so I erase any doubts from any of the participants, we will share all of the resources. This webinar is being recorded in case anybody else has missed it or would like to watch it again. It will be made available to you. And we'll also try to save some of the chat conversations because they have been really, really great. So we have maybe a few minutes left for some questions, and it seems like Dr. Wiliam is still here and able to answer questions. If so, we'd love for you to come up and give some feedback. Otherwise, I know you've been really busy in the chat writing. And we've got a few questions. Yes, you are still here.
Yeah, I'm still here. I mean, I've got this going on until 10:30, so I'm able to stick around until 10:30.
Okay, great. I thought I saw a message where you couldn't, but I'm so happy to have you.
No, that was Prasad. I misunderstood what he was asking me. I can stay till 10:30.
Okay, amazing. Well, now that we have you here with us, if you have any thoughts or any comments for any of the panelists or anything you'd like to share now, I'd love to pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. I think the thing that we've learned in our work on what I would call short cycle formative assessment over the last 25 years is that it's really hard because it involves changing habits. So teachers often ask questions and give students less than a second to respond. They like going to a good, strong student for a quick response so they can move the lesson on. And so I think one of the most valuable insights we've gained over the last 25, 30 years is that changing short cycle formative assessment is more a matter of habit change than knowledge acquisition. So, having teachers to look at data, teachers doing problem solving with some data in a spreadsheet can be a very valuable process. And it's quite easy to do. What I've discovered is it's much easier to change what teachers do when students are not present than it is to change what teachers do when students are present. And so it's not surprising to me that many of the approaches to formative assessment have focused on data, and that's a very important thing to be doing. We do want to make sure that this year's students are getting a good deal. If students aren't making the progress they need to be ready for the next grade, then that's a problem. But if that's all you do, then next year's students will get the same deal as this year's students. We'll have a kind of Groundhog Day phenomenon. What I'm suggesting is that schools need to do both. They need to make sure that this year's students are getting a good deal. They need to make sure that next year's students get a better deal because teachers' capabilities for responding to the needs of the class have improved. So that, I think, is the difficult balancing act that every school, every teacher has to do. Yes, I need to make sure that I'm monitoring student progress and making adjustments if students aren't learning, but I also need to make my teaching more responsive to their needs, and it's a slow process. And I think the real problem here with much professional development around the world is that we have mistaken the nature of teacher expertise. We think that we can tell teachers what to do to be better, and we can't. The knowledge that expert teachers have is not like the knowledge of how to solve an equation. I can explain to you how to solve an equation. The knowledge that expert teachers have is more like the knowledge of riding a bicycle. I can't explain to you how to ride a bicycle, but I can create an environment in which you get better at riding a bicycle. And so I think that the challenge for us, and the thing we've been very pleased to learn, is that self-help groups of teachers with no external resources can actually help each other improve their practice by making greater use of short cycle formative assessment. And this has a massive impact on student achievement. That's the big idea here. There's several points in the chat about large classes. When I used to lecture the student teachers at the Institute of Education, I would actually be teaching 1,000 students. And I would ask them questions, and I'd ask them, what happened in this experiment? Was it A, B, C, D, or E? And I'd make them finger vote. And I'd ask them at the end, did the fact that I was going to make you vote make you more engaged? And they all said yes. So yes, it's much harder to do well in large classes, but it's still possible. So there's kinds of classes of 50 to 70 that are common in much of the world. It isn't quite as good, it isn't quite as responsive, but the fact is that as long as teachers are paying attention to what did I just do, what did my students learn? As long as teachers are paying attention to that process, I think huge progress is possible. And here's one more reason why focusing on that classroom process is a good place to start the conversation. When administrators start asking to collect data on student achievement from a computer or some other system, the teachers generally think of that as being a bureaucratic imposition on their work. This is somebody checking up on me. But every teacher I have ever met knows it's part of their day job to figure out, did my students learn what I just taught? And as long as we're focusing on that process, did my students learn what I just taught? Then first of all, every teacher sees that as a legitimate focus for their professional development. And it seems to be the most powerful thing you can help teachers get better at in terms of student progress.
Thank you so much, both for that practical example and that very resistant comment. So I'm so glad that we still have you, and we are coming short to the time on this webinar. However, as we've been saying throughout the program, we do have another session that is starting right now. So if we did not have time to answer all your questions, or if you have more questions, I want to point you to the chat where my colleague has just dropped the link. We will be getting started there in just a few minutes. Also, you saw the quick screen of the report. If you are interested in the topic, please do download the report. We've got lots of relevant information on there, and also more information on all of the innovators who have spoken today, who I want to thank once more for spending their time with us, and for spending their time with us, not just today, but over the past few months to help us to create this report. So if you are interested in learning more about the innovations highlighted, please do download the report. We will share that link both here and in a follow-up email. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Wiliam, for the inspiring conversation and also the very important message here. Thank you for our partners at the Jacobs Foundation who joined, and thank you to all of the audience for your engaging questions. Hope to see you right now in the next session. We're going to be starting a new platform, so there might be some learning curve. We're open for more formative assessment on it, and we hope to see you in the next 100 webinar. So with that, one of my colleagues will stay around for just a little while in case you get lost, but we will meet you right now in the next session. So hop over to wonder.me, and thank you again so much for joining.
Thank you, Mariah. See you at wonder.me.